The pathogenic approach, looking for the original cause and trying to do something about it, according to Antonovsky's, actually is remarkable insight, if you think about it, because it turns the whole of what we normally think of on its head. This was published, though, in the 1980s. It's quite old stuff. Antonovsky himself died 15 years ago. Yet the implications remain tantalizingly absent. You might have come across in your community development work or related courses and things an approach called salutogenesis. And it was Antonovsky who coined that word. Saluto means health, genesis, origins. He said we should be asking the question, what are the origins of health, rather than what are the origins of disease? And the origins of health are in our resilience, in our environments, in our social relationships, as much as in the exposures we have to trauma and toxins and all of those kinds of things. Salutogenesis, the origins of health. There was a period of time when people writing in health promotion, health improvement, used to use the idea a lot, but it kind of comes and it goes. But I think it's fundamentally important. And it gives rise to us focusing on things like people's natural resilience, the way they cope with problems, and what Antonovsky called their sense of coherence. Because what he found among the Holocaust survivors, what he found when rethinking or reworking his data from the American blue-collar workers, was that those that lived ordinary lives, those that managed to pull things back together, it wasn't that they hadn't had difficulties or traumas, obviously in the case of the Holocaust survivors, but equally in the case of the American blue-collar workers. You know, they had difficulties, they had problems. But they had a kind of a psychological reserve, tank, if you like, which gave meaning to their life. They kind of had a view of the world that says, well, okay, things can be difficult, can be bad, but all things considered, I'm okay, I'm still here. Tomorrow's another day, and tomorrow could be a good day. Rather than dwelling on morbid problems and difficulties. And this coping takes place all around us. This coping is everyday life. And I think when you listen to people with behaviour change solutions, you have got, and often when you're doing behaviour change with individuals, what you're really saying to them is, I want you to be a different person. The way you are now is not good. We need to change you and change the way you behave. Now, it's a pretty difficult proposition, isn't it? If someone came up to you in the street and said, look, I just don't like the way you are, we want you to be different. You know, our natural human response is to say, okay, thanks very much, goodbye. But much public health work is focused on doing precisely that, with a strong, sometimes very moral implication that what you're doing is bad for you. And I know best, because I'm the public health specialist, and I'm telling you basically you're a bad person. You smoke, you drink too much, you don't take enough physical activity, you're too fat. And we know, and I've done it myself on the television, gone on and said, yes, rates of obesity are costing the National Health Service so many £1 billion. We've really got to do something about the obesity problem. Drink, I've been on complaining about the levels of alcohol consumption among the population, which are very high, it has to be said, and are very dangerous. But there's often a very strong kind of moral connotation that goes with that. The approach that I'm talking about here, the population approach, asks us to think beyond the individual. Individuals can do themselves harm, for sure, but the harm takes place within a context which is not of those individuals making, by and large. The fact that you can buy cheap vodka in my local supermarket for about £5 a bottle, not surprisingly, kids go and buy it. You know, anyone who thought they wouldn't, when I listened to ministers saying, well, people need to act responsibly, of course they do. But if you put that kind of temptation in people's in front of people, what we know, of course, is that the heaviest drinkers always migrate to the cheapest forms of alcohol. Surprise, surprise, the damage is done. So where does coping take place? In any environment in which you like. to introduce now a concept you may not have come across before, but it tries to gather together the ideas of coping, resilience, and the concept is called the life world. It's a translation from German. The Germans call it Lebenswelt. It's a concept used by philosophers. Now, don't worry about the concept too much, other than just imagine this. Each and every one of you has got a set of things in your head, and amongst the most important of those things in your head are the things that are most important to you. So that might be your relationships with your kids, your husband, your parents. Beyond that set of immediate relationships, there will be other people, your friends, people that you used to know, people that you know who are overseas, your compatriots, but who aren't with you at the moment, but are still important to you. Then beyond that, there's another circle beyond that of people that you're familiar with, you know, but you've never met. The government, Mr. Cameron, they're very familiar to us, and they're clearly part of your life world, but they're not people in your immediate vicinity. And beyond that, there are circle upon circle of people who are ever more distant from the centre of your life world. The centre of the life world are the things, that bubble that's around you, which are the things that are the most important to you in terms of your everyday life. It changes, of course, because as you grow older, as you move, as you develop, as the family grow older and move away, the contents of the life world move on, but you still have a life world. Life world is terribly important. That's this idea of circles, just referring to. This is at the very centre, the things most important to you now, today, next week. These are the broader things. And out here, people you probably will never meet, but you can perfectly well understand. So if I said to you, can you imagine what it would be like to be a gay bus driver in Sydney, Australia? You may never have met a gay bus driver from Sydney, Australia, but you can conjure up in your head roughly what that might be, or what he or she might be like. But what's really important to you is what happens here. What's really important to you as well is this is where you experience the stresses, the strains, the insults, the material difficulties of your life. That's why they hurt so much. But it's also, of course, where that resilience develops, where the resilience allows you to resist the things coming in from elsewhere. That, of course, is an individual model, and we aren't isolated individuals. You can think of different people having different life worlds living separate from each other. But that's not how it is. Actually, we live in overlapping life worlds, with people who are close to us, with people who are our friends, with people we work with our children, with our parents, with our lovers, and so on and so forth. And it's in the overlapping life worlds where the stresses and strains of the insults, of the material difficulties, of the experience of poverty, of the experience of disadvantage, of the experience of prejudice, of the experience of all of those things are felt both individually and, of course, collectively. But these overlapping life worlds are also the places that build strength. They're also the places that allow us to withstand, individually and collectively, the things that are going on around us. And most of us, our life worlds are a kind of mix of positive and negative things. There's probably no one on the planet who could say, my life world's perfect, and everybody else around me lives in a perfect environment. We all have ups and downs and all have difficulties to bear. But it's how well you withstand them that determines a whole range of things, including your health. And that, of course, is why it's no good thinking about individual health. You have to think about population health in terms of a series of overlapping life worlds, but lots of people all together. It's about, in other words, relationships between people. If you think of isolated individuals only, you're missing the most important part of a description of what it is to be human. Of course, we live in a world which for the last 600 years in the West, then in the United States, North America and Australia, and then eventually the rest of the world, has prioritised the individual. Each and every one of you has got your own individual national insurance number, your own individual birth certificate, your own individual educational qualifications, your own individual driving licence. On the census, you're there as an individual line in the census distinct from the other people you live with. To run a modern economy, to run a modern government, to run a modern state, you have to classify individuals. In fact, it's longer than 600 years because if you think of the Christmas story, they were off to the census that the Romans were organising to count the people in the empire for taxation purposes. If you tax people, you need to give people individual identification. So it looks like the individual is really important, because actually modern states can't exist without individuals. Just pause for a moment. Are you an individual? Surely the essence of being human is being in relationships with other people. Those relationships may be very positive, they may be very negative, they may be very demeaning, but the nature of relationships is fundamental to the experience of everything from love, work, attachment, loss, bereavement, happiness, are all about relationships with other people in this notion of overlapping life worlds. Now, the way we cope in the life world, the way we cope with difficult things can be delimited, can be brought down to four important types of skill. Four important types of skill. And what we know from the scientific evidence is that the degree to which people have these skills, or are allowed to develop these skills, or can share these skills with others, are critically important in what Antonovsky called the sense of coherence. Are critically important in building resilience, in building trust, in building the things that allow us to withstand the slings and arrows that life throws at us. Now first, some of these things are technical. Being able to do certain technical things is actually a prerequisite for modern life, but it was a prerequisite for old-fashioned life too. So, you know, in the 13th century, being able to ride a horse was a pretty important skill. But how many people in this room can ride a horse? Two? Two? That's good. I can't, you know. I once tried to get on a horse, and you know I did. I got on it the wrong way around. So I put that foot up first and went that way over. But in the modern day, the ability to read, to write, of course to use basic computational material or computational devices. Imagine a world in which you couldn't log on, didn't know how to, were completely dyslexic with respect to using. I find actually, I'm 62 now, and my level of skills for using digital is rapidly evaporating. And it was, I was confronted with somebody the other day, and I had the sense of frustration that I began to experience because I just couldn't work it out. I couldn't work out what bit of the screen I was supposed to be looking at, which bit to touch and press. And this morning when we went to the airport, I went up to the desk, you know, I said, I'd like to check in. She said, no, you've got to use the machine. I want to talk to someone. I don't really want to go to the machine. But of course you have to go to the machine, put your passport in, look at the number, find it on your mobile phone. Oh dear. But technical skills are vital and important, and the more you've got mastery of those, you've got a building block. Now think of the world in which skills like being able to cook, being able to shop, being able to communicate with others are absolutely fundamental to human life. And if you don't have those skills, or they are seriously eroded, then you are in a very difficult place to start with. And it's not just me fiddle-faddling around, we're trying to book an airplane ticket or book a flight. So technical skills, really, really important. That's why literacy is so important. Basic numeric skills. If, as we do, have an education system in which many children leave school without those leave school without those basic skills, you're creating a generation who start with really one hand, or two hands perhaps, tied behind their back. Many years ago, when I was doing community development work in Glasgow, I remember being astonished, perhaps I shouldn't have been astonished, but I was, working in a particularly deprived part of the east end of the city, and finding there were people there who actually didn't know how to use the cooker that was in the flat that they got from the council. So they didn't know how to use the cooker, so they didn't know how to cook. They didn't have an understanding. Another skill that many of them didn't have was of time, or time management. So, the community development workers would set up meetings, and people would kind of roll up 3 hours later. They didn't have that kind of skill because many of them had never been to work. There was no need to be anywhere on time. And it was extraordinary, made things very difficult. In the same project, actually, we were working with people from the Springburn Locomotive Works, which had just been shut down. And there were many trade unionists who were involved in this community development project. And those guys had no problem turning up for meetings. They always got there, because they'd had a discipline of work since they'd been in their teens as apprentices. They kind of just knew it wasn't anything, they didn't even think of it as turning up on time as a skill. But I think you get my drift.